Welcome to the Ford-MacNichol home at the corner of Biddle and Vinewood Streets in Wyandotte, Michigan. Originally the property of former mayor of Detroit and general during the War of 1812, John Biddle, the land itself has a long history which can be traced back at least 200 years. Biddle owned the property for roughly 30 years before deeding it over to the Eureka Iron Works, a landmark company known for piloting many new iron and steel processes such as the Bessemer process, of which a plaque currently resides at Bishop Park. The company was founded by Eber Brock Ward, an influential businessman who would become Detroit's first millionaire. Unfortunately, changing times signaled the end of the Eureka Iron Works, which shut down operations by the 1890s. In the middle 1890s, the residential property was then deeded to the Ford family. Not the Ford family who would eventually make a great deal of wealth in the auto industry. These Fords were the founders of the plate glass industry in America, and the impresario J.B. Ford founded the Michigan Alkali Company, a chemical corporation which supplied raw materials to his family's plate glass business in Toledo, Ohio. The company also produced numerous household supplies and similar products, making J.B. Ford and his family wealthier than they were previously. J.B. Ford and his wife Mary had two sons who lived to adulthood. The eldest, Edward, became the founder of the Edward Ford Plate Glass Company in Toledo, and in the middle of the decade the house was commissioned to be built for his second daughter Laura and her new husband, George Pope-MacNichol. Built by the firm of Malcolmson and Higginbotham, who would also construct the Bacon home across the street 1 year later, the grand structure was completed in 1896. Depicting the American Queen Anne style of the late Victorian era, the home displays a wraparound porch, asymmetrical exterior, and the popular and unique rounded tower, which is a major architectural feature of such structures. Inside, American leaded and stained glass can be seen throughout the home, which is equipped with 7 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and 6 fireplaces. The height of technology at the time, the Ford-MacNichol home possessed indoor plumbing, a heating system, and electrified lights. The MacNichols lived in the home for roughly 7 years before departing for Toledo and selling the property to Jeremiah Drennan. Mr. Drennan was the city attorney at the time, having his own law library inside the house, and he and his wife Frances and 5 daughters moved into the home. A well-to-do family themselves, anything the Drennan girls did was subject to an article in the local papers, and 3 of the daughters would remain in the home until the 1960s. After over 60 years with the Drennans, the property was empty. In order to save it from being torn down, Wyandotte native and member of the Historical Society, Yvonne Latta, purchased the home in 1967. Over the next 10 years, her love for the city and its history could be seen by many, as she would sometimes be found on the roof shingling, replacing piping, flooring, or walls inside the mansion. We have a lot to thank Mrs. Latta for, as it was because of her hard work the city was able to purchase the property in 1977 to be converted into a local museum. After 3 years of restoration, the 6,600 square foot Queen Anne style mansion became the Wyandotte Museum in 1980. Since then, it has welcomed thousands of guests, held hundreds of events, and hosted dozens of weddings. That's right, you can get married at the Ford-MacNichol home. Let's take a peek behind the walls of this grand home to get a snapshot of Wyandotte history, as well as how a more affluent family may have lived at the turn of the 20th century. So welcome to the inside of the Ford-MacNichol home. When you first walk through the door, right over in this direction, you're going to come through the vestibule, which is kind of like this little entrance here with genuine Pewabic pottery made in Detroit on the floor. And then you'd be welcomed into what's called the foyer, or reception room. Now this would be the first room that a guest might enter in a home like this. Again, the Ford family was quite wealthy at the time, so they did have servants. And so a guest might come into this room and be welcomed, maybe have a seat on the benches around the windows here, leave their calling card, and then the man or the lady of the house would come in, welcome the guest, and take them into one of the informal parlors, which we'll see in just a few, to kind of conduct their business or meet with each other. There's a lot of great things in this room here. One thing is we've got some original plate glass here surrounding the doors. A lot of what you're going to see in the home today is donated materials, not original to the home. However, there are some items that are. Like for instance, most of the light fixtures, this right here, I believe would be one of the most beautiful in the home actually. And again, this family did have electrified lighting and gas lighting as well originally. The doors are original, doorknobs, things like that. But what's really interesting is we've got this wallpaper here that you'll see throughout the hallway on the first and second floor. This is called Lincrusta wallpaper. It's got kind of a 3D or raised look to it. In this room we also have the largest of the 6 fireplaces. This is also the only fireplace that is a wood burner. So hopefully you'll get to come back in December, because when we have our festive Friday nights, we light this fireplace, and it's pretty nice, warm and inviting. The main staircase here is home to 81 spindles. Woodworking throughout the front of the home is golden oak. Not sure how well you can see it, but what we have up here is 3 different types of molding. The dental molding, which looks kind of like teeth, right? Hanging from a mouth. So the little wood blocks. And then above that, you've got egg and dental molding. And then you may also be able to see that up at the top of the landing, we have some original stained plate glass as well. Now, some of our early local citizens and former owners of the home that you heard about recently are also pictured in this room. So, if we take a look over here, we've got Laura Ford and her husband, George MacNichol. Now, these photos were likely taken well after they moved out, probably around 1920. And lastly, over here is Yvonne Latta. So she is the one who purchased the home in the late 60s to save it from being razed and to save it from further deterioration, and has a lot to do with why it looks the way it does today and how you are able to take a virtual tour. So let's go on to the next room, which is the formal parlor. So here we are in the formal parlor of the home. The formal parlor was a very important space in Victorian era homes, and especially homes of wealthy families, because it was where a lot of the most important events are going to take place. Weddings, receptions, things of that nature. Also, funerals would happen in the formal parlor. So if you kind of think of funeral parlor, right, a lot of that may have had something to do with the naming of the room or the naming of the funeral parlor itself. So you would have come through these pocket doors. You can actually see some that would lead into the next room here. So these are wooden doors that can be pushed back into the walls when not closing off the room. These right here are the Fords. Now again, J.B. Ford actually was the founder of Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company and made a lot of his wealth in the plate glass industry before he came to Wyandotte to start the chemical company. This is his wife, Mary. As was mentioned earlier, no relation to Henry Ford's. In fact, a lot of the reason why J.B. came here was because hundreds of thousands of years ago, this area was rife with salt water, and that has all ebbed into the earth over time. And with the salt deposits in the earth, J.B. Ford knew that salt, a lot of the properties of the salt could make the best soda ash, which made the best hardened plate glass. So he came here. So to differentiate the Fords, these Fords, from Henry Ford's, they would call these Fords the Salt Fords, and the Henry Ford family the Auto Fords. So what you'll see around this room is we have this picture molding up here that surrounds the entire room. Now, plaster walls can be, number one, quite difficult to nail into, and number two, could also be brittle. And so this is a way to hang your photos without having to worry about damaging the walls. So what you do is you have these S-hooks here that kind of rest on the molding, and you can hang your pictures from those, which, if you ever watch old films or anything, or old TV, you notice that pictures kind of go like this, or lean a little bit. That's why. We also have a coal-burning fireplace in this room. And we do have a lot of photos of some local citizens in this room as well, including back here we have Major John Biddle. This is the tower of the home right back here. So this is what you would see outside, the conical fixture outside, the tower that actually epitomizes the Queen Anne style. And Major John Biddle was the one who lived here initially, or had this property, and this is his wife Eliza over here in a painting as well. Now, one other thing that you'll notice in this room is that we have a pump organ, and we have a little parlor game or activity that a lot of kids would take part in. It was a way to kind of get out and get away and see the world without being able to actually do that. These, again, are the days before movies, television, and radio. So this is called a stereoscope, and you have these little slides here, these projector slides. Put your eyes through here and you can see a different part of the world that you probably would ever be able to see otherwise. It's very fun for kids and adults too. So let's go ahead and take a walk further on, and we will take a look at the library. So before we head on into the library, I wanted to take this time to just give you some information about the long hallway here, especially as it has to do with the era in which this home was built and the family that lived here. So again, the MacNichols were quite wealthy, and they had 3 servants. Their servants were of European descent, and they were a maid, a cook, and a nanny who actually resided in the home. Now, as a result of that residence, you would have what's called a separation of classes in the home at this time. So directly to the front of us here is the door to get in the home. And so when you would come in the door, you would see this long hallway here, which is quite indicative of that separation of classes, where the actual family and their guests are going to occupy the front of the home, or where we are right now, and the servants are going to occupy or work in the back of the home. Now, it's very interesting how they differentiated that, not just by the different parts of the home itself, but the woodwork that you'll see in the home as we get back there. So up here, you see all the golden oak and everything. When we get back there, you'll see more cheaper woods, if you will, like pine and such. So very interesting. So let's go on and move on to the library now. Welcome to the library of the home. If you might recall from the opening sequence here, so Jeremiah Drennan, the second gentleman who owned the home, was the city attorney at the time that he initially lived in the home. And as such, he needed a place to practice. And so this could have likely been that room, because we did have the built-ins on the wall over in this direction with his law library. Now in this room, we have another fireplace. This is another coal-burning fireplace. Now, what's really interesting and unique about this fireplace is these Delft tiles surrounding it. They're all different scenes, all hand-painted from Holland or the Netherlands. This is one way, as we talked about the wealth of the family, another way that you can tell the wealth of the family, to have something like this handmade and shipped in from another country. This over here, this table right here, is the only original piece in the home. So earlier we talked a little bit about the fact that most of the furnishings and such were donated, but this right here is original from the 1890s. And another interesting aspect in this room is this piece of glass right here, which actually adorned a home across the street. Now, across the street, directly across, we have the Bacon home, which is currently the library. And then next to the library, which is the parking lot, there was a home called the Hearst home. James Hearst was a lumber baron who had a mill on the water over where Bishop Park is, and his house was torn down in the mid-60s. This was actually part of his front door. So give you an idea of how large the front doors were. Incidentally, this is a good time to tell you, you could take a second to think about why the doors were so large and wide in homes of this age. A lot of people say, oh, it must be because they're wealthy, so they have to have everything large and grand. Well, not exactly. There's a more practical reason for that. As you saw in the formal parlor, we have funerals in the home, so to bring in and out caskets, the doors have to be able to accommodate that. So let's go ahead and move on to the music room. Well, here we are in the grand dining room of the Ford-MacNichol home. What we have here is a normal dining room from, of course, the Victorian era, complete with a fireplace, coal-burning fireplace. This is the 5th fireplace in the home. Again, I don't believe I mentioned this earlier, so I'll do that now. The surrounds on all the fireplaces are original to when the fireplaces were installed back in the 1890s. So we have set up for a meal, or maybe tea or soup or something of that nature here at the table. A couple interesting things about this particular dining room. Now the picture molding does continue through the dining room. So we do have several pictures hanging, including one of Mary Ford Bacon, who actually lived across the street in the Bacon home, which is currently the library. We have this beautiful cabinet that is filled with china from Limoges, France. So genuine Limoges china, which can also be seen over here. Now, Limoges china is quite high-end. This was actually donated by Eleanor Ford Torrey, who we just saw in the music room. We have this very grand mirror also. Now this mirror actually sat in the Bishop home. So if you recall from earlier when we were in the library, we talked about the Hearst home, which was directly next to the Bacon Library, which is currently a parking lot. Directly next to that on the corner, which is currently the Bishop Co-op building, stood the Bishop home. Now Jerome Bishop was, he had a fur company. He was a trader. He made fur coats and other items as well on the water down here where Bishop Park is named after him. And from the 30s till the time it was torn down in 1969, the building actually was Wyandotte City Hall. So this was actually a mirror that adorned that home. And apparently it took 16 men to bring this over, and they walked it across the street in 1969 at the time that Yvonne Latta owned the property, and it has been here for about 50 years. And another neat thing that we have here that is very indicative of the separation of classes is underneath the rug, there is a little button that the man of the house, which would normally be sitting at the head of the table here, would push with his foot. Now what that would do is that would alert the servant in the kitchen or the pantry to come on in, take away one serving, bring in the next serving for the family and or the family and the guests. So the butler's pantry, which is actually through this door, it's right next to the dining room. It has a swinging door. So what's very interesting about that is that you can still see the beautiful golden oak throughout these rooms, the doors, which by the way, because I don't believe I mentioned it earlier, these were very common in the era. These were called Christian doors or cross doors because of the cross in the center of the doors. Okay, and so you see the oak here, and even in the butler's pantry, which is normally a servant's area, you would still have the oak. But the butler's pantry is kind of like a pass-through to the kitchen where we'll actually see that wood change. So go ahead and follow me and we'll go on in there next. Well, here we are in the kitchen of the Ford-MacNichol home. And again, this would be the servants' area. So, as such, we have the changing of wood. So what we have here is what you would think of as a brushed or unfinished pine, much different from the glorious golden oak or cherries that would normally adorn a home like this, especially in the front. The family isn't likely to come back here. Guests are never really going to come in the kitchen when the MacNichols lived here, so they really didn't need to spare the expense of the rich woods. So the kitchen here is designed that they did have indoor plumbing. So as a result of that, they did actually have a sink fixture in the room over on the wall back in this direction. Currently we have a wash tub over there, which is really indicative of the Ford family or the MacNichol family. However, just about everything else is similar to what would be in a room like this, including the stove with a lot of early implements of the time, like a waffle maker, right? Bread maker, cornbread. This is an early toaster. Over here, we have a pie safe to keep your pies and pastries and such warm or to cool after being baked. This right here is your ice chest or early refrigerator. Now, having a refrigerator was certainly a luxury for a lot of early families in the earliest days of refrigeration. Refrigerators themselves aren't always extremely expensive. Some families did have outhouses or basements where they could store ice broken from the river right down across the street here during the winter. But if you didn't have that luxury, then you might have to have ice delivered, which is one of the biggest expenses for having a refrigerator or an ice box. So if you see any of these old homes with these signs like this in their windows or doors, you know that they had an ice chest. So the ice sign, anything that, whatever number is facing up, tells the iceman what to break off for you and deliver to put into your ice chest. So today, we can hold 25 pounds of ice. Okay. Now, one really neat thing in this room, over here on this wall, these are called speaking tubes. So the speaking tubes are kind of like an early intercom system. And the other end of the speaking tubes are up in the master bedroom. And the thought is you would speak into one and put your ear to the other to listen to the response. Now, whether or not they worked, really can't tell. We've tried them out. It's kind of like two tin cans and a string, but this would be the precursor to the telephone in a home like this. So we're gonna go ahead and move up to the second floor and see how the family lived up above the first or main floor. So here we are on the second floor of the Ford-MacNichol home. This is where the family would have slept. Also, there is in the back of the second floor a servant's bedroom, which we'll see in just a little bit. So the nursery here is the first room on the front of the second floor, and the family, the Ford family or the MacNichol family, actually did have 4 children, and a few of them were actually born in Wyandotte. However, none actually in this room, but you can sort of imagine the pitter-patter of little feet in this room. This is what's called a Jenny Lind style bed, very popular at the turn of the 20th century. We have this cradle here, which you can see the Gothic attributes of it, came from St. Patrick's Church right across the street, where they would take care of children. What's really interesting about this room is that we do have 2 closets. So in a day and age when a lot of homes didn't even have 1 closet or a closet in every room, a nursery had 2 decently sized closets. Now, another thing that's very interesting about this particular room is that it adjoins the master bedroom. Now, even though the MacNichols had children here and they did have a room where their children could be right next door, they wouldn't likely have taken care of their children in the middle of the night. So let's say little George wakes up in the middle of the night screaming. Normally, the nanny would come down maybe from her room up on the 3rd floor to take young George up to her room to sleep for the night and allow mom and dad the time to rest. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of played out. But so we've got a lot of period toys around here. You see the old bowling game, an old slate from school. This is a Wyandotte toy, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, so this is the nursery. Let's go ahead and move on into the master bedroom. All right, here we are in the master bedroom. As you can see, this is quite a lavish and grand bedroom. In fact, when I bring people through here, most of them want to stay. So maybe you might want to stay as well. What you notice first is the tower area, which, if you can remember, the formal parlor, which would be 1 floor below, that would also be the tower. So you can kind of get an idea of where we are if you're standing outside the home. So what we have here also is an original chair from the Drennan family, the second family that lived here. This is a brocaded rocking chair. This chair came from the Arlington Hotel, which actually was down at Oak and Biddle, and was in existence from the 1880s to 1919. So a lot of local pieces. We also have the only fireplace above the 1st floor over in this corner, and it was a coal burner as well. Now, the speaking tubes that we talked about in the kitchen can also be seen up here in the master bedroom over on the wall back in this direction. So if you could just imagine waking up in the morning and saying that you want I don't know, over easy eggs and some orange juice, you would use those speaking tubes. So we were going to go ahead and move on to the next room, which is actually the changing room. So these rooms, again, they all adjoin. And so we've got the nursery, the master bedroom, the changing room, and the second floor bathroom. So if we kind of go through this direction, we'll make our way through the changing room and into the master bath or the second floor bathroom. So this would be a bedroom on the second floor, but you probably notice it's kind of a work in progress. We are getting this room ready to be turned into a children's hands-on room where we can have period reproduced toys and activities for younger people and maybe even adults to come in and play with or interact with in the future. But what's really interesting about this room, and I implore you to maybe take a look back at this later on to see the before and after, is, well, first of all, this wonderful painting that actually fell off the wall on its own recently. We're kind of getting it fixed in here, but the real focal point of the room is this mirror. Now, this mirror right here is very important, especially for its place in plate glass history. Because when J.B. Ford started his first plate glass company in New Albany, Indiana around 1868, he started it because he was a little unnerved that America didn't want to take on the plate glass industry domestically. At that time, plate glass was being made over in Europe and shipped in from overseas. And he thought, you know, we can do that here and we can cut costs. So he started his company, and this right here is thought to be one of the first two pieces of plate glass that was ever turned out in America around 1869. Now, what happened to those two pieces of plate glass that were both exactly the same size here is they were eventually silvered and turned into mirrors. And so we have this plaster surround here. And they went to a couple of descendants of J.B. Ford, and we have this one here, which, as you can see over time, has fallen. And this is part of our little interactive exhibit. There are some things in the museum here that folks can interact with and touch. The mirror here has been sealed. So it looks cool, it feels cool, it's safe, and it's very historically important. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next room. So here we are in the fourth family bedroom on the second floor of the Ford-MacNichol home, which is currently utilized as the Bill Shop. So operated by the Wyandotte Historical Society, you can come into this room and purchase an item. We have many different items in here. Gifts, we've got Wyandotte plates, cat's meow items over here. One very interesting thing about Wyandotte is we are such a small city, but we've got so many passionate people, and a lot of publications have been written on the city and the area. And so if books are your thing, come on down to the Ford-MacNichol home and buy a book. Now the room in particular was said to be the room where Jeremiah Drennan, the second owner of the home, died. So for those of you who are always curious as to whether or not these homes are haunted, I will always point out that it depends on who you ask. So we have some stories that abound, but from my experience, I think most can be explained away. But interestingly enough, Mr. Drennan did pass away in this room. So we will go ahead and move on to the end of the hall and then up to the third floor. Here we are on the second floor in the back of the Ford-MacNichol home, and this would be, so again, the bedrooms and the bathroom are at the front of the home in this direction. This would be where the servant's bedroom would be on the second floor. Now the house had 7 bedrooms. We saw the 4 family rooms. 3 other ones were for the servants when the MacNichols lived here. So this would have been one. It's also the smallest bedroom in the house. Now it is closed because it's currently used for storage, but come back in the future and it should be open. We have a lot of period or vintage toys that children would play with here. And then behind is the stairway to the third floor. But what's really interesting back here is this stairway right here. Now, the reason why that's interesting is that here in this home, wealthy families of this time in their large homes would normally have a front staircase and a back staircase. So the front staircase would be for the family. Now, guests wouldn't normally be coming up to the family space or where they would sleep. But the family would use the main staircase in the front, the servants would use the back staircase, and usually they weren't interchangeable. So that's really what's neat about this landing area here. So we're gonna go ahead and move on up to the third floor because there's a few rooms up there to take a look at. Here we are on the third floor. We are in a servant's bedroom. Now, this is a really neat room because of a few features that you see in here. If you remember when we were down in the nursery, we talked a little bit about what might happen if one of the children woke up fussing in the middle of the night. This could likely be like a nanny's room where she would have her bed here and a small bed here to bring the child up to sleep with her, to get the child calmed down and fall asleep and not bother mom or dad. What's also really neat about this room is this window, actually. Because I like to tell people, if you take a look out this window and you can just kind of think back to 100 years ago, I know you weren't there, but just kind of imagine if you take out Tim Hortons and the street and everything, almost everything that you see was here. This and the next three homes, the temple over there, the church over there, a lot of structures were here 100 years ago. So if you were sleeping in this room looking out this window, you could kind of get an idea of what you would have seen. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a room that most people don't get a chance to see. So let's go ahead into the third bedroom. This would be the third servant bedroom on the third floor of the home. Currently, it is actually a room where our period linens and fabrics and items of those type are stored behind acid-free cloth, in acid-free boxes. You can see how large this room would have been. Normally we do keep this room closed to visitors. Sometimes if the group is small or there's no one else in the museum, we might open it up, such as what we're doing today for you. You get a chance to kind of see what we have behind closed doors. So what we have here, again, is all these different items. Up here we have a lot of wedding dresses. There's a lot of hats in here. We've got flags and pennants, and then a lot of clothing items hanging on these racks, including christening dresses that go back more than 130 years. We have sporting uniforms, we have Civil War uniforms, we have mourning dresses that the ladies would wear when they were in mourning of the death of a loved one around the turn of the 20th century and such. And then a really interesting piece of history that we have here is a collection that was owned by Ann Marston, who was a local celebrity and archer who was actually Miss Michigan in 1960. Unfortunately, she did pass away from a diabetic stroke at the age of 32 in 1971. But we do have all of her pageant outfits, and you can see that this is this one right here. So this rack going all the way back, we have Ann Marston outfits. We also, in the cabinet behind here, have other items such as clothing accessories like boots and hats. We have tiaras, crowns, trophies, almost anything you can think of, jewelry. So lots on Ann Marston, who was a very popular person in class of Roosevelt 1956. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch gears and we're going to go down to the basement and talk a little bit about a more robust history of Wyandotte. Here we are in the basement of the Ford-MacNichol home. Now what really strikes guests as they come into this home is, first off, how they never knew what was behind these doors. They come into the MacNichol home and they're just taken aback by the beauty of it all. But when they get down here, it's so strikingly different because it's more museum-like, right? So what you would think of as the Henry Ford Museum or something like that, or a museum of that nature. This is essentially what's called a historic home museum, where it's decorated to appeal to a certain time. But down here in the basement and in the attic, you'll see more of a broad history of Wyandotte in the area. Now, it's set up in all these panels here, which starts back by the door over in this direction with Wyandotte and the area before people. So thousands of years ago, when all we really had here was salt water. Yes, there was actually salt water this far inland. So salt water and wildlife, fish, trees, plants, things like that, not really people. And then we move into how over time that all changed to allow for the first peoples to come to the area, the Native Americans, which include the Wendat or the Wyandot, who, actually at the time we were called Mahuahua or Mungwagan, and this is all detailed right through here, including the fact that fishing was rife. They had wildlife that they could hunt and trade furs with. They really did use this term Desprachaska, which means here is everything. And it's funny because I like to tell guests today that it's kind of still the same. Here is everything in Wyandotte. Okay, so we don't have a Walmart and a Meijer and everything, but we have the history, we have the shopping, we have our own utilities, we have the waterfront, we have the restaurants, we've got a lot of stuff here in this small city, so really here is still everything. And then what we have in this showcase are some early Native American implements such as net weights for fishing, and then projectile points for hunting, and a makuk, which would be used to carry maple syrup that was recently trapped from a tree. As we move on further, we get into what led to or built up to the War of 1812, and then eventually the removal of the Native Americans through the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818. And then in this side of the basement, we go into the after effects of that. Major John Biddle purchasing the land here. Early industry, Eureka Iron Works, the chemical company, which we can think of as the second really big company, shipbuilding, which took over the area for many, many decades. We actually were also building ships for World War I effort. And then through just kind of what the water implies for us as a community as such, like, not just the shipbuilding, but doing a lot on the water, to catching the Columbia and going over to Boblo Island if you were alive between 1898 and 1993. You could do that. So that was an amusement park at the time. But there's quite a lot of really neat things down here that are interactive for folks. So we've got this log here, which for a time it was thought, it had been in the collections for a long time, it was thought that it could have been part of a war that was waged, or a battle that was waged during the War of 1812 here in this area. But then over time, several years ago, it was found that it actually dates from 1862, and it comes from North Georgia. There was the Battle of Chickamauga, which occurred there, and so it was, however it made it into our collections, we do have it. Guests can come touch it. What's really interesting is that we do have cannonballs, 2 of them in the tree here as well, that guests can get a feel for, 157-year-old cannonballs. This is also an area where that's very interactive. We have beaver pelt, we have fox fur beads. Back at the time, the Native Americans would have made the beads out of bone and such. Powder horn, and then over in this direction we have a ship's whistle. So again, we were shipbuilding was very important here in Wyandotte, and so we have a ship's whistle and a reproduction of a cargo hull to kind of just bring that history home to full realization for guests. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move up to the 3rd floor attic gallery, and that's going to be a continuation of what we've seen down here. So come on, follow me. Well, the last area that we're in the home is up on the 3rd floor again. This is the attic gallery, and this initially would have been just an unfinished storage space that the family would have used for their items. and likely would have possibly just sent the servant up to get them what they need, because they didn't always make the trek up and down the stairs themselves. But currently what you're going to see is just a continuation of what we saw in the basement. So the history of Wyandotte, but what we have here is we pick up from, go a little bit back to the 1800s to today, and we have it separated, all these themes that have to do with the city of Wyandotte. Now, before we talk about those themes, let's take a look at the center of the room here, because this is where we have our little devotion to the Drennan family. Now, earlier you saw a lot on the MacNichols. You saw some pictures and such. You saw Yvonne Latta's photo, but we didn't have a lot on the Drennans downstairs, so we have that up here on the 3rd floor. Now, again, the Drennans was the second family that lived in the home. Jeremiah and his wife Frances, 5 daughters. The 5 daughters were Bernadette, Catherine, Mary Marguerite, and Josephine. Now, of the 5 daughters, only 2 married, and of those 2, only 1 had children, and she had 8 children, actually. The other 3 remained in the home until the 1960s. So this is all devoted to the Drennans, all on loan, for the most part, from Drennan descendants as well. Now, over on this side of the room, we start with the municipality, or you think of fire and police and such. So we've got some helmets and voting, and this is really interesting right here. This orb in the center, underneath the fire department helmet, with that purple liquid inside. You take a second to think about what you think that might be, but what it is it actually would be an early fire extinguisher. So this would be filled with a liquid, and eventually found out to be a dangerous liquid, tetrachlorohydrate, and that unfortunately causes harm to people's health. So in the 50s, it started to become outlawed in the United States. And then further continuing, we have just kind of having fun in Wyandotte. This is an early street fair sign. We had a Wyandotte Monopoly game. Over here is architecture. So a lot of the homes across the street and throughout the city of Wyandotte in the 1960s and 70s were torn down during the urban renewal process. Again, this home in the late 60s was going to be one of those victims. Thanks to Yvonne Latta, that was not the case. But the one up here that's hanging that says 2651, that was actually James Hurst's address panel from across the street in the middle next to the Bacon Library. If we go on over to this direction, before we move to the back of the space, we have industry. So the creameries, the newspapers, the chemical company, lots of different items from early industry in Wyandotte. And then we have more on the chemical company and other businesses such as shipbuilding in here. And then sporting. So this is actually an Ann Marston trophy up here. A lot of pictures, trophies, and items from early Wyandotte sports. Wyandotte has always loved their sports. A lot of Wyandotte companies have had their own sports teams. And we had a historic baseball team called the Stars, which they have been revamped back in the 2000s, and they play again today. So over in the back here, in the back of the attic gallery here, we have early education in Wyandotte, the public school system. Now, Catherine Drennan, who had lived in this house, she actually was a teacher for about over 20 years in both McKinley and Garfield Elementaries, and for a time in the 1920s was the principal of Garfield Elementary. So a lot to do with education in this house. Josephine was also a teacher. Over here, which is very interesting, is a showcase detailing something that a lot of people just don't really know about. We talk about industry in the city of Wyandotte. We focus a lot on the chemical company, the ironworks company, and so forth, but we don't really talk a lot about the toy company. So Wyandotte did have its own toy company that was in operation from the early 1920s to the mid-1950s, and it was called the All Metal Products Company, and a lot of times they would get their metal from the local automotive industry, and they would use scrap parts and such, and they would become known as Wyandotte Toys, and their motto was, Wyandotte Toys are good and safe. They can still be bought. You can go onto eBay and find them, and they're quite collectible. So if you see any for cheap, I would say buy them up. The last part of the home to see is the third floor tower area in the back. In the back of the attic gallery here, we have early education in Wyandotte, the public school system. Now, Catherine Drennan, who had lived in this house, she actually was a teacher for about over 20 years in both McKinley and Garfield Elementaries, and for a time in the 1920s was the principal of Garfield Elementary. So a lot to do with education in this house. Josephine was also a teacher. Over here, which is very interesting, is a showcase detailing something that a lot of people just don't really know about. We talk about industry in the city of Wyandotte. We focus a lot on the chemical company, the ironworks company, and so forth, but we don't really talk a lot about the toy company. So Wyandotte did have its own toy company that was in operation from the early 1920s to the mid-1950s, and it was called the All Metal Products Company, and a lot of times they would get their metal from the local automotive industry, and they would use scrap parts and such, and they would become known as Wyandotte Toys, and their motto was Wyandotte Toys are good and safe. They can still be bought. You can go onto eBay and find them, and they're quite collectible. So if you see any for cheap, I would say buy them up. The last part of the home to see is the third floor tower area in the back. So the last space that we're in the home is the tower area in the attic. So here we are above the parlor, above the master bedroom, at the very top of the home. If you look out the window, you can see the Bacon Library right across the street. Now, you can see the unfinished area here. You can see the wood. We have, if you look up, this beautiful conical tower area, the roof. And if you could just imagine, again, we talked about wealth of the family much earlier, but you can really see it up here, because what's really interesting is that there's many reasons that a home like this would be a home occupied by a wealthy family. And a lot of that had to do with the customization of everything that's inside the home. So in order to have these woods curved, the carpets curved, and especially the glass curved, you would have to have some money. Now, of course, this is a family that dealt in plate glass, so they probably didn't have to spend much on the glass, but a normal family would have to spend a great deal of money to have this type of curved glass installed into their home. This over here is a dollhouse that is actually a Queen Anne. So it's not this particular home. This is, though, a Queen Anne style home, which you can see again from the tower. And this house would have a double balcony and a widow's walk on the top of the home as well. So that's the Ford-MacNichol home. I want to thank you for taking the time to come and visit with me, and hopefully you'll get a chance to come in person and we can meet and chat, and you can tell me what you learned and ask as many questions as you'd like.